Good morning again. It's wonderful to be together in worship. So glad that you're here. You made it safely, and good to be together in this warm place as we are worshiping together. We're finishing our series of sermons, Red Letter Christians, this morning, and in these few minutes I want us to think about how we can put into practice these words of Jesus we heard a moment ago that Graham read for us. They're words about serving. Our topic today is how we should serve. Over and over again in the Gospels, Jesus talks about serving. He says that whoever would be great among you must be the servant of all. Jesus took a basin of water in the Gospel of John and he washed the disciples' feet. He took on the role of the servant and he said to his disciples, "As I have done to you, so you must also do." You must serve. Over and over again, these words of Jesus to reach out and to address the needs of others appear. And this parable that Jesus tells, in 25th chapter of Matthew, really drives the point home. The parable of the Last Judgment is usually called. And you notice that everyone in this parable, those who are righteous and those who are not righteous, the sheep and the goats who are separated one from the other by the Lord, are surprised, all of them. And what surprises them is this whole notion that when they have done something for a brother or sister in need, or when they have neglected to do something for a brother or sister in need, that actually it has been as though they had done it or had neglected to do it to the Lord Himself. And everybody is surprised. The righteous go about doing good without realizing what they're doing, and the unrighteous go about neglecting that without realizing what they are doing. And the parable says that the way we treat our brothers and sisters and whether or not we serve really matters, and it matters to God. And so we have these words of Jesus calling us to serve, and we, in our membership vow in the church, service is part of that vow. When we think about our discipleship, we have that concept in our congregation that helps us think about our discipleship and to put into practice all the aspects of discipleship that we call healthy plate discipleship, so that we have a healthy plate of food. We have all the good stuff, some of everything, if we have a balanced, healthy plate of discipleship. And one of those items is service, is to serve. It's important. But there are some things that stand in the way. As simple as it sounds, this list, if you will, of acts of mercy, to give food to the hungry, water to the thirsty, to welcome the stranger, to give clothing to those who have no clothing, and to visit those who are sick and in prison. These seem like very simple things, and it is perhaps the most straightforward of Jesus' teaching on service. And yet we know that it's not always that simple, is it? There are some stumbling blocks that can get in our way. And as we're moving into this season of Lent, which is a season for thinking deeply about our walk with Christ, it's the season when we really turn inward in a way, and we think about our own discipleship, and we think about how we're doing as being God's people in the world. As we're entering this season of Lent, we need to think about those stumbling blocks and those barriers that can stand in our way. For example, one of those is fear. We're afraid sometimes to serve. We're afraid sometimes to reach out to a person in need. We're afraid we don't know the right thing to do. We're afraid that we won't make any difference. We're afraid that we might be rejected. We're afraid of someone who's different from ourselves. I mean, the list can be long of how fear can stand in the way. But that's not God's will and way for us. 2 Timothy says that God has given us a spirit not of fear, but a spirit of love and a spirit of self-discipline and a spirit of power, not fear. But we know that fear can be a stumbling block in the way. And so as we are moving out of this series and thinking about following the words of Jesus and moving into our series on finding grace and being able to listen for grace and to spot grace where it appears, we are thinking deeply about these barriers now that stand in the way of serving. Fear is one of them. 1 John says, perfect love, that is mature love, complete love, whole love, casts out fear. Another stumbling block that can stand in our way is greed, just to put it quite simply. Jesus talks a lot about this too. No one can serve two masters. You'll love the one, hate the other, be devoted to the one and despise the other. You can't serve God and wealth or God and stuff. And we need that reminder. It can be a stumbling block to us. In spite of the fact that Gordon Gekko said that greed is good, it's not. It can quench the spirit. It can impoverish our souls. And in fact, it can impoverish even our communities, even our nation, even our world. Greed is not good. And it can be a barrier to our serving. There are a lot of ways in which, as much as we desire to serve, that we can find ourselves pulling back from fear or from greed. Or how about assumptions that we make about those in need? Or theology that's really not good around that subject of helping those who are in need, of reaching out to the poor. Sometimes we make assumptions. Well, they're lazy, they don't want to work, they've made their bed, let them lie in it. I mean, sometimes you hear that kind of language, and often it's much more subtle than that, but that notion that we can stand as judge of that brother or sister in need, it can happen, can't it? If we're honest with ourselves. And it can be a barrier to our serving. Herman Melville said that one of the horrendous things that we do is when a person who is well-fed, well-warmed, and well-clothed makes judgments and assumptions about those who are not. And it's true. And it's a barrier to our serving. And then there's apathy. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that apathy can creep into our lives very subtly, very slowly, almost gracefully. We find ourselves kind of losing interest, or perhaps overwhelmed in such a way that we shut down and we just stop caring. The prophets and Jesus, time and again, called on us to care for our brothers and sisters over and over again, reminding us that we are all connected, reminding us that what affects one affects everyone. And yet we need that reminder again, over and over, that this can be a barrier to us, this business of apathy. Prophet Amos said, "Woe to you who are complacent in Zion, who have beds inlaid with ivory, who recline on your couches and eat the best cuts of meat and drink bowls of wine, but do not grieve the ruin of your brother or sister." And what's he talking about? He's talking about apathy, not caring. It's one of the 7 deadly sins that the early church fathers identified. They called it sloth. Sloth sounds kind of like laziness, just lying around, not doing much. But it's much more profound and deep than that. It is, the Greek word is akadia. It means I don't care. It means seeing a need and not caring enough to respond to it and to serve. And it's a barrier to our serving. And as we move into Lent, I encourage all of us to pay attention to those barriers and remember this call to serve, and that when we serve others, when we reach out to someone in need, we are reaching out to the Lord himself. E. Stanley Jones, the great Methodist missionary, spent most of his time in India, founded about 75 years or 80 years ago, founded a prayer ashram. In fact, there was a whole ashram movement, and there were ashram meetings in the United States, and perhaps still are. I don't know if that's still going on or not. But there was this ashram community of Christians, those who'd been converted to Christianity, those who lived together in community, and they agreed that they would share all the tasks and, the cooking and the cleaning and everything. But there was one member of the upper caste who had been converted to Christianity, and when it came to cleaning the latrines, he drew a line. It's beneath him, that job. And when he said that he would not do that because it was a task beneath him, E. Stanley Jones said, but you are a Christian. You're under the lordship of Christ now, and we've agreed to live in community, and we recognize that we're all the same. There is no caste system among the children of God. And his response was to say, Brother Stanley, I'm converted, but not that far. I'm converted, but not that far. And that story has always challenged me because it makes me ask myself, how far am I converted? And how often do I back up from this business of serving? And how often do the barriers to serving appear in my own life? I encourage you, as we think about what it means to be a red-letter Christian, following the teachings of Jesus, to think deeply about those barriers and to remember when we serve others, we serve the Lord himself. Now I want to read a little devotional piece that Mother Teresa wrote. She was hospitalized at the time she wrote this. It was a meditation on this passage of Scripture, as a matter of fact. She wrote it in 1983, and so some of the language that she uses and her descriptions might appear just a little startling and dated to us, but her words are powerful. She reminds us of the breadth and the depth of our call to serve and the presence of Christ in it. She wrote, Jesus is the hungry to be fed. Jesus is the thirsty to be satiated. Jesus is the naked to be clothed. Jesus is the homeless to be taken in. Jesus is the sick to be healed. Jesus is the lonely to be loved. Jesus is the unwanted to be wanted. Jesus is the leper to wash his wounds. Jesus is the beggar to give him a smile. Jesus is the drunkard to listen to him. Jesus is the mental to protect him. Jesus is the little one to embrace him. Jesus is the blind to lead him. Jesus is the dumb to speak for him. Jesus is the crippled to walk with him. Jesus is the drug addict to befriend him. Jesus is the prostitute to remove from danger and befriend her. Jesus is the prisoner to be visited. Jesus is the old to be served. And she described the life of the Christian in this way. The life of the Christian is loving as he loves, helping as he helps, giving as he gives, serving as he serves, rescuing as he rescues, being with him 24 hours, touching him in his distressing disguise. That phrase is striking, isn't it? His distressing disguise. The message of this parable is that the one in front of us, the one before us, the one that we meet is Jesus. And sometimes, as Mother Teresa put it, in distressing disguise. And our call is to serve. There is a story that Leo Tolstoy wrote more than 100 years ago. And it's a story that's called, it goes by the title, Either Where Love Is, God Is, and I think that's the original title. But it's often called Martin the Shoemaker or Martin the Cobbler. It's a story about a cobbler who made shoes, and he lived in a little basement room in the village where he lived, had a window up at the level of the sidewalk, and so he could watch the feet of people passing by, and he knew those feet. He'd He was an old man now, and he had been around for a long time, and he had made most of the shoes that walked by, and he had repaired many of the shoes that walked by, and he knew who those feet belonged to. And he remembered the shoes, and he remembered the people. And so as he worked, he would look up, and he would see familiar people walking by. He could only see their feet. He was a devout man, read the Bible every evening after he finished his work, and one evening he fell asleep as he was reading the Gospels, and he had a dream. And in that dream, Jesus came to him and said that he would visit him the next day. It was a vivid dream. It was a powerful dream for him. And so he woke up the next morning, and he cleaned the shop, and he prepared a meal, and he waited. And he waited for some unfamiliar pair of shoes to come along. Maybe some sandals, even on a very cold day as it was. But he saw an unfamiliar pair of shoes, and it was a little girl. And he heard her coming down the steps to his room, and a knock on the door. And he went to the door, and she was there and asking for something to eat. So he invited her in, and he shared with her the food that he had prepared. And when she was fed and warmed, she went on her way. And he waited, looking out the window for that unfamiliar pair of shoes, perhaps a pair of sandals that might come the way when Jesus would visit. There was a knock on the door again, and this time it was an old woman, cold, shivering. He invited her in to warm herself, and when she was warm, he sent her on her way with a shawl that he had to help keep her warm. And he waited and he watched for the special visitor. And when it was beginning to get dark, there was another knock on the door. Another pair of unfamiliar shoes had passed by. This time, a beggar. The shoes were falling off of his feet. He was practically barefooted. And so he gave him a pair of shoes, let him warm himself, and he went on his way. Martin was disappointed. He was devastated that he didn't get a visit from Jesus. He read his Bible, and as he was reading the Gospels, he fell asleep again. And in his dream, Jesus came to him, and he said, "Lord, I waited for you all day. I prepared everything for you, and you never came, as you promised." And he responded, "Oh, Martin, I came 3 times. I came in the little girl, I came in the woman, I came in the man without good shoes." When we meet another person, Christ calls us to see that other person as Christ himself, often in distressing disguise, but that is our call. And so, my friends, as we move into this season of Lent, I pray that we would all think deeply about how we live this out in our own lives. Let's pray. Oh, gracious God, we hear again the challenge to serve, and we know there are barriers to that, and help us by your grace, oh God, to remove those barriers from our lives that we might faithfully follow you. Give us the eyes to see Christ in the other.